Hi everyone, I'm Ariel. I'm very honored to be here to represent the Junior State of America. For those who don't know, the Junior State of America, or JSA, is a nationwide organization. We're nonprofit, we're nonpartisan, and we're fully student run. And our goal is to provide high school students, both in their high schools and at 3 major conventions throughout the year, with debate, activism, politics, and civic engagement. Within that organization, we have a number of leadership positions, and I have the honor of holding the position of Midwest Governor, so I oversee 10 states, including Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And beyond that, I'm a high schooler from the suburbs of Chicago. I do theater tech, and I'm a big fan of data.
Hi everyone, my name is Maritza. I'm the Arizona Governor and the National Vice Chair. I'm a junior at ACES Tucson North, and I would consider myself an advocate for educational equality, and I'm also a part-time environmental scientist.
Hello everyone, my name is Ashna. I am the Southern California JSA Governor, and I'm also a member on JSA's Board of Directors. I'm from Orange County, California, so just near LA, and I'm a senior at the Orange County School of the Arts, and I'm also a student researcher, opera singer, and debater.
It's now my pleasure to bring up Caitlin, the Texas governor and our moderator for today's talk.
Hey everyone, my name is Caitlin, and as Ario just said, I serve as Texas governor, so I live right outside of Dallas in the suburbs of Plano, and I go to Plano Senior High School. In today's discussion, I'm really excited because we're really going to I hope to give some unique insights about the role of policy and technology and political activism in general, and how Gen Z is playing a critical role in that. But before we get started, I think it would be really interesting if we thought about what's the first word that comes to mind when you think of Gen Z. So if you guys scan the QR code and fill out that form, we're going to be able to see all the words that pop up, because I feel like there are a lot of conceptions about Gen Z, and I'm really fascinated to hear what people who aren't in this generation think about us. In the meantime, Ariel, do you want to give your insight on what's the first word you think about?
A word that I would use is definitely chutzpah. I think there's a lot of kick there.
Okay, Maritza?
I would consider my generation innovative.
I would definitely say action-oriented.
Okay, so looking through the words, there's passionate, oh my gosh, these are such positive words, like connected, empowered, change makers. Dang, I feel really complimented by this, because we were expecting lazy, annoying, or stuff like that, because honestly, sometimes I feel like I can be that. But so I see entrepreneurship, solid expectations, passionate and resourceful seem to be the number one. So I think, I guess on my take, just to speak on what these words are, is that I do think that this generation is uniquely, I don't know, we all sort of find a pretty niche passion. As Maritza mentioned, she's really into environmental advocacy, and I myself am really interested in AI policy. So it's kind of interesting that we're diving into these real world issues. But anyways, moving on. Oh, I see flexible. What is that flexible? And okay, I need to search that word up later. Next. So in today's panel, we're going to offer 3 uniquely different stories, and hopefully through these stories we see a new insight or perspective about Gen Z. And I'd love to have Ariel start us off.
So today I'd like to talk a little bit about gay-straight alliances, or GSAs. Some organizations have been Project 10s, or sagas as they're sometimes known. But in finding out what position GSAs have in our schools, it was important for me to see where was the first GSA. Now, if you look this up, you'll see the most common result is in Concord, Massachusetts, with Kevin Jennings. And while Kevin Jennings did create a very visible GSA and is largely credited with starting it, my understanding was that while this was important, he went on to found GLSEN. GLSEN still supports educators in creating educational programs for their students on queer topics. But 17 years earlier, I'd like to dive into something that happened at another school. But, okay, so here we have George Washington High School. This is in New York. It is no longer called this. It's split into 4 high schools now. But at the time, George Washington High School there was a lot of turmoil. They had 4 principals in the last few years. There was a lot of riots. There were violence happening. And the student body expressed that they did not feel unified as a group. but they had a new principal, and this principal instituted new policies to try to bring connection. So Caitlin, if I can get the next slide. What he began to do is facilitate these communities, which was very convenient because at this intersection, one 18-year-old student, Ellie LaMadrid, approached her teacher, who supported her in creating the very first school-supported GSA. And it was convenient that both her teacher supported her and the principal supported that teacher. There was administrative support all the way up, which obviously was not common in the early 70s. And though this predated many of the court cases that we would see with GSAs in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was still obviously a topic of social disagreement. So we can see that Washington High was a predominantly black and brown school, whereas schools like Kevin Jennings was predominantly white. And in contemporary studies, we see that with predominantly black classes, there was stigmatization over Project 10s or GSAs, where there was not the same level of stigmatization in predominantly white schools. And yet we see that this first GSA was supported and founded in a school predominantly that's black and brown, and supported students who were predominantly black and brown. And they created a list of 3 demands, and these demands were essentially a manifesto. And they stood strongly in support of the fact that their school should remove all textbooks that preached against homosexuality or said that it was some sort of illness or were in alignment with that view. And they felt so supported by their administration as to create this very first GSA.
I think it's really interesting how you point, like how you even found this story, because like from my research, like I never even knew about this specific high school. And I think that this story really illuminates like the question, like why, you mentioned admin support, so like I guess why was George Washington High School able to find such unity over such a bit of a controversial topic?
Yes, so where they were able to find unity was because they had an incredibly supportive administration. At the time, there were a lot of teachers who simply did not want to sponsor that kind of club, and there was a lot of danger involved. But the support of not just you can create this space for you to facilitate, but you can also make this list of demands and publish it, it was really revolutionary in terms of how they approached it. That's not to say that it was incredibly perfect. Students from this GSA, which was about 20 people or so, said that they did not feel comfortable to host social dances in the same way that predominantly straight clubs did. So that's not to say that everyone got along perfectly, but they were able to find a tightly knit community, largely because the administration, the push from the principal, was to create that kind of unity.
So I think then like bringing up this historical example, how this ties back into Generation Z and our activism, like how do you think Ariel or anyone on the panel, Gen Z is creating similar inclusive spaces today? Because we see like in the past, it's really been, the success for that has been like strong administration support. What has changed? What has continued? So if anyone wants to go.
Yeah, I'll go and I'll add to this. I would just like to also add that even though we've seen increasing support for queer communities at schools, at my school, it's been difficult to establish a GSA, and it's still something that's currently happening. I'm the vice president of my school's GSA, and it's been tumultuous with the administration. It's always very dependent on what the idea of the principal is regarding these topics, and if they want to deal with the pushback that parents might be sending them. In terms of how we're creating more inclusive communities as a new generation, definitely finding different microcosms online and being able to spread awareness for the issues that we're most passionate about through social media is a huge factor that's contributing to our personal unity and inclusiveness. But we have to balance the superficiality of social media activism and our own personal values with our own community.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point of social media and Discord and the rise of things like that, which create, of course, a very safe online space, whereas maybe in person or school settings, students might not feel comfortable expressing a queer identity or any other identity of theirs. And I'd just like to share like an anecdote that I think is very powerful at my school. So I go to a performing arts high school, and the administration and the environment is just very accepting of diverse communities, LGBTQ communities especially. And like for example, for Pride Month and we have a Pride Day and we go all out. We have huge celebrations during lunch and really putting this spotlight on an accepting community and creating that environment, I feel, is really what helps kids feel comfortable within their own identity. You're celebrating an identity of theirs, so kids end up feeling more comfortable to come out, more comfortable to express their identity on a daily basis. And so I think that really creates a safe environment on school campuses.
And I think what bridges uniquely in Gen Z, the community that Maritza you feel and Ashna that you feel, is that we no longer have to be entirely reliant on school administration to facilitate those communities. We can now go and create those communities virtually and be in spaces where we feel comfortable and safe, even with people that we don't know, or if we're not connected through space or even time.
I'd really like to touch on that because I'm not sure, most of the people in the audience I saw are educators and teachers who, don't really experience the prevalence of this technology. Personally, Discord servers or Instagram group chats, I don't know, these might, it's so easy for me, and I know I'm speaking on behalf of honestly all of Gen Z, to talk to a stranger halfway across the world. And that, I think, is something that we have never seen before, obviously, but it's the openness and the willingness for students to be able to connect and find common threads and and I think that's also why activism is becoming more prevalent in our generation, but kind of guiding that conversation more towards, in the sense that we are more autonomous, we don't need those traditional authority figures. How do we ensure that this activism and this unity is safe? Because, the digital world, the anonymity of not having the face, there are risks to that. So I was just gonna ask, how can students and teachers students and leaders work alongside authority figures and educators to create these safe spaces in the digital age?
I'll give my own point of view in this discussion. At my school, there's this huge balance between how much you want to involve administrators into your social media experience and your own personal life through media. And we have to balance the regulation that the schools would enforce and how we might give away some of our freedom for protection against people who use our own personal experiences and our honesty against us. And so an effective way of being able to communicate with administration while still keeping your own personal privacy and that safety and comfort is being able to speak with administrators either anonymously or be able to take classes where you understand not the dangers of social media, but how to properly use it and what the consequences, both good and bad, are of your actions. Because we traditionally only focus on stuff like cyberbullying, and we only see the negative consequences of the use of social media, and it's sort of this view of fear-mongering on the use of this digital connection. But we need to be able to facilitate these conversations with our administrators in a positive light in order for them to understand how we're viewing media, because it's different to how they view the media.
And Ariel, I saw that you...
So there is obviously a risk when you're posing these online spaces, which is why even though we don't require administrative support, it is so important for teachers and administrators to provide those disconnected spaces and help students who are looking for them find ones that are safe. Because students will be seeking out those communities if they feel like they're not connecting to community in their school. And being able to connect students to safe communities is how we can prevent any sort of unsavory behavior. So, for example, the Junior State of America, which we facilitate, we had online conventions, and we still continue to have online conventions even after COVID. And through that, we can connect people. I knew Ashna pretty well, who lives in California, whereas I live in Illinois, before we'd ever met. And we were able to cultivate those communities that were student-led and student-organized. But we had administrative support and teacher support and the support of our staff enough to be able to vet those spaces and create them consciously enough. And spaces like ACLU summer programs have affinity groups virtually where people from racial groups, demographic groups can meet up and have those spaces.
Then I think like another question that comes, we talk a lot about these online communities where discussion is important for activism, but I think this comes to a greater question. If Gen Z is so involved in like these online spaces, these Discord chat rooms, these Snapchat, I don't know, there's so much that you can explore on, but how is online activism then translating into real world change?
Well, I think when we think of the real world, we think of like a physical expression of what it is. I think right now with activism and with the kind of translation between what is online and what is in person, there is some gray area between that. Right now, we are seeing activism new on Instagram, on social media. People are posting about it. Hundreds of viewers are seeing it every day. That is activism. You are spreading awareness. You may not be verbalizing it physically, but I think in the sense that is kind of this new digital age of what activism is. It's redefining it.
And so much of what activism comes to when people feel disempowered is they don't feel like they have the voices or the manpower to get something done. If I were to try to organize something at my school, I don't know if I could always pull the number of people to do a letter writing campaign or to write an op-ed or something like that. So being able to connect beyond my geographic bounds, to host activism events that are physical and stem off of the awareness that's built on social media, that is cultivated through online connection that we see among Gen Z in a way that we haven't seen before.
And piggybacking off of Ariel, it's important to understand the demographics within our own schools and the communities that we're trying to organize, because we're trying to understand what people are interested in and what people care about the most. And that's something that we as students are trying to focus on, because there are a billion issues in this world, and we're trying to narrow down what are the issues that our community wants to deal with, what are the issues that we want to tackle. And using social media or creating different forms that people can fill out to verbalize what they think is another way of connecting with our communities and seeing that digital activism translate into physical organization.
So hearing what they've just expressed, I guess really the key to it is social media, and not just social media, the digital world really allows Gen Z to work from the bottom. I feel like in the past, lots of activism starts from these huge organizations where they organize it, but literally at the student level, when you have a certain number of people, you can start planning things on your own. So I guess we've talked a lot. I'm really interested to see what you guys think. What communities could most benefit from online spaces? Because I feel like this is as Maritza just mentioned, there are so many. I think this is one thing that our generation faces, in the age of information, where it's so easy to go down rabbit holes about all these fascinating but pressing problems in this world. It can be very daunting. So
I think for this question, it's definitely based on where you come from. I go to a predominantly white high school, and in conversation with representatives from the BSU, the Black Student Union, and staff members of color, we see that there is just simply a disconnect of integration into the school-wide community. So for my school, 100% a community that could benefit from online spaces would be communities of color, whereas other schools would not necessarily have that problem, but they might have a problem of LGBTQ marginalization or any other form of demographic marginalization that's lesser seen at that school.
And I think it's really interesting that someone said teachers connecting, because I also feel there is, as students, we have experienced the effects of education, the teacher shortage. I come from a large public high school in Texas who often is underfunded, and we have classes where students are sitting on the floors because there's not enough teachers to teach, and there's 35 kids in one tiny cramped room. But I also think one thing that from Gen Z is that using this online space to try to foster community between educators and students, and then also other responses.
I'd like to add on. I think it's interesting whoever wrote intersectionality, because I feel right now I've seen a commonality of minority groups and various minority groups within a particular geographic region. But I think with digitalized activism, people are able to communicate maybe common experiences that they feel between marginalized communities. I think that that's a great point.
Okay, and then, so I think this discussion has been really important, and now kind of speaking on the online space, this kind of segues to our next kind of story-ish about Maritza. Maritza, take it away.
Okay, so when we are talking about activism, we look at timely issues or historical remembrances, including the variety of narratives which circulate one story in specific. And the internet has challenged historical facts and used subjective stories to establish different interpretations of these different activisms, or these activism initiatives. And in our current time, this raises the question, how inclusive are the narratives within our society, and how does inclusivity and comprehensibility alter our understanding of identity's development throughout history? And so this brings me to the story of La Malinche. And if you've ever taken a history class or a Spanish class at a certain point in your high school or middle school experience, you'll have heard her name lingering in your textbook. And La Malinche's story is consistently inconsistent, is how I would personify this. And in a lot of classrooms, our teachers are taking from like this brief availability of the context and knowledge of her story, but it's very important for us, her story is very important for us to understand the realities of the conquista in Latin America. And so La Malinche, just to give an introduction about who she was, if you haven't heard of her, she was a Nahua woman born in the 1500s. She was sold into slavery at the age of 12 by her family. And to many, she represents a sort of leader, an indigenous leader. To others, she represented a spy or a traitor. And so there has been this consistent trade-off of what should we call her, and this interpretation of redefining her own identity in the larger context of the conquest. And so this same phenomenon of changing the context behind stories and historical happenings is something very prevalent in our current educational system, where we're altering historical facts in order to better fit our own political agendas or our own personal moral standings. And so we're giving in to trying to find a more comfortable space for us, but sacrificing the accuracy of many different texts or the accuracy of different educational resources and courses in general. This extends beyond history, it extends into sexual health education. And that's a current controversial topic in the entirety of the United States. And we also see it present in the battle against critical race theory.
So I think it's interesting that you mentioned like all these really controversial and hot topics, but then kind of boiling back down to the facts and like trying to decide what even is true. Like how do we believe things that like when there's so much information given in this new online world? And so I think at a classroom basis, like as all students ourselves, it's like teachers just have a tremendous impact on like how your worldviews are. So I guess asking to you guys, how do we think educators can foster open-mindedness or can foster like I think Jen's like a will to diversify your narratives?
I mean, I think that, I mean, kind of speaking from personal experience, I've had teachers who go off the books just to provide a new perspective. My English teacher, for example, I remember a few times where she would go off the textbooks and then she'll have a time in class or a certain time allocated for it. You guys don't need to take notes on this, but you should know this. You should know this perspective and this perspective that I'm going to share now. And then she would share various other takes on the history that we are learning about, that saying that goes against maybe what is in the textbook and what is right by the rules and by maybe the AP exam and things like that. But she wants us to develop a more well-rounded perspective of the history that we are learning, which I think is really important because you can't get one narrative and one face of the textbook and then think that's the end-all be-all.
Then I guess how do you think school spaces have influenced activism as a whole in Gen Z, and how are Gen Z activists aiding in preserving like narratives and creating inclusive spaces in that we all seek like different ideas. Does anyone want to touch on this? Like, how do we think school spaces have influenced our activism?
So, actually, if you can move to the next slide, I have been able to take a very comprehensive AP US History lesson, and that's really due to my charter school AP US History teacher. He was nominated for National Charter School Teacher of the Year, and he has always prioritized and enabled us to learn the greater context behind the historical events that we're learning. And it's been very important to us in understanding how race has evolved in U.S. history, because it's connected to a lot of major events such as the change in immigration policy, and it's reflected in many Supreme Court cases that we've seen, and how the definition of race has altered these decisions, which completely alter like legislative pieces. And I have like a list of these different cases that we've seen and been able to learn from. And one of the most important cases is Mendes versus Westminster. This was a case where Mexican Americans were being segregated in the California area. And at that time, Mexican Americans weren't considered people of color, they were considered white. And so this definition of race, of whiteness at this time, was able to change how the Supreme Court went about segregation. This decision was 8 years before the Brown v. Board of Education was decided. And the way that we had established what the race of being white was completely changed these like kids' ability to attend these schools, and it also changed the legal systems. It created this loophole that allowed for the discrimination of other people of color by identifying Mexican Americans as white. And so there has been this, it's important to talk about this because we see how the surrounding context has influenced these different pieces of legislation, and it goes back to the original story of La Malinche, how if we need to have the ability to have the greater access to all of the story in order for us to understand why things happened. And that was reflected in the U.S.'s history. We've had a huge battle with immigration and citizenship, and it's prevalent today, and it's been challenged due to our perception of race, and it's been seen in the cases of Toshiko Inaba, Plessy v. Ferguson, the U.S. versus Bhagat Singh thing, which he was an Indian man who challenged the definition of Caucasian when attempting to immigrate to the United States.
Then I think, so we've talked a lot about how Gen Z is very eager in diversifying our narratives, seeking history beyond like, what might be in the textbook, and also trying to see things from completely new, different perspectives. As student activists yourself, how do you feel like that has influenced and changed activism at its core?
Well, activism based in protecting, we're talking a lot about stories. And we now have access to these stories like never before, which ultimately has been a barrier to empathy, where people have been in spaces where they simply did not hear these stories. There was not an ability to generate empathy and care for communities like Mexican Americans who were not able to, who were marginalized by the misdefinition of race. So through having the entire internet at our disposal and through managing that incredible access responsibly, because obviously there's information on the internet that can be not ideal, through managing that information, we can access activism in a different way, in that we can use these stories and lift up voices that hadn't been lifted prior.
Then how do we manage, I think, as teenagers, seeing all this information, seeing all these stories, and being able to effectively filter what you mentioned, that there's information that is not ideal. It can be dangerous to have anything you want to hear at the tips of your fingertips when, there's all sorts of news channels or other websites that will, spout information? How do we, as Gen Z, be responsible activists and not perpetuate false narratives or inaccurate ones?
I think the stories that are misconstrued are also important for understanding the greater relevance of a story. And so by seeing how, of course, we have to fact check things, and using scholarly articles is a great way of verifying that the information you're going to cite and use is correct, especially peer-reviewed articles. That's a great way of making sure that the information you're reading and you're going to be using is accurate. But the inaccurate information is a greater reflection of our current social priorities, and it's a good way of understanding how to go about certain issues and discussions. Why are people altering stories the way they are?
I think we also see that it starts earlier. When we have in-school librarians and librarians as a whole, that provides people with a connection to research and internet literacy that they would not have had. Librarians are incredibly crucial to people's abilities to access information and learn how to access information, as kind of providing guidance to that whole world of information. And we can see that libraries are becoming a focus of certain campaigns by people in terms of removing access to certain stories. And so continuing to stand strong with libraries and the ability to access information within them, and the ability for students to access media literacy programs in their schools and research literacy in their schools is pretty fundamental to creating those steps.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess we're going to do like a sort of open mic session. I think we're all really interested to hear, like, has a student perspective influenced the way you approach your profession, or like anything related, or any questions related to what we just spoke about. And if you do have a question, please come to the microphone or comment.
Not this question. Yeah, I don't really have a question and I have to run, so I was going to leave you a note. I loved how you use like Melancholia and history to reflect what we're debating right now. It even gave me more ideas of how I can reach my own students. Maritza, I really was here. Check out El Eterno Femenino by Rosario Castellanos. Have you heard of it?
No.
She rewrites Malinche's story from a feminist perspective. You can email me, I can send it to you. It's short and fast.
Thank you.
But I was highly impressed by each of your presentations. This is amazing. Thank you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're all, a little bit nervous here because I've never been in a room with so many adults, like looking at these conventions, no one seems like our age, and I'm just walking like, oh, do I look like a student? But anyways, yes, thank you so much. I don't know, I think, oh, well, Ariel, you were going to say something. Oh, never mind.
Are there any other questions for us so far?
Or
Either that.
Yeah.
Maybe a response to that as well.
I have a question. I'm Isabel, and I work for an higher education nonprofit. My question is, when you get old, I'm 26, it's hard to stay in touch with what Gen Z really thinks because you're just not in the same spaces as they are. But that's who we build for. So my question is, how can old people like me really understand deeply? Everyone wants to talk. I'm really excited. Okay. How can we really understand deeply what it is that you guys are interested in and excited about so we can build the best things for you?
Okay, I think we should each just give one sentence
Yeah, I
have a
of
lot more
what
than
we
a
think.
sentence.
Okay, we can each talk for 15 seconds. Okay.
Okay,
You go
so in essence, I think no matter what generation you're going to talk to, we all value the importance of learning and understanding others. And so being able to use social media, in essence, to connect to Gen Z is a way that you can do that. But we will always have the value of the hunger for learning.
Sorry, I have a question. Are any of you guys on TikTok? Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's a little bit, but in terms of, I feel social media or TikTok, take for example, people are using social media to platform any sort of opinions that they have, anything related to politics or even beyond politics. I mean, I think social media in that way is a very powerful tool. But beyond that, just like Maritza said, we all value listening to others. We all value expanding our perspectives. And so I think, like, I have a few teachers who do discussions at the beginning of class. Say, does anyone want to lead a discussion? Or does anyone have questions that they would like to start with? Any topics that students are talking about that's very heated, whether it be political or non-political. That allows students to have a space to talk about anything that they would talk about beyond the classroom. But this time, the teacher is in there. I actually have a few classes who do that, and I've seen the teacher be engaged in conversations that would otherwise only have students. So I highly would recommend that, I think.
My response to the question, I think you don't need to know like the latest slang to be able to participate in Gen Z discussions. What it comes down to is a genuine interest in hearing those perspectives and creating opportunities for Gen Z to talk to you. So there's a model called the Roberts Ladder of Youth-Adult Partnership. And what we see in it is a kind of step-by-step progression of how youth and adult connect to create partnership. And you have level 3, which is tokenization. And that's just having kids talk to you. And then you say, pat yourself on the back and say, we listened. Now we're going to do what we want to do. Or you can get up to like a level 8, which is really connected, working side by side to make decisions and have young people involved in the decision-making process. So there's no expectation for adults to know everything that Gen Z is doing and to have that kind of, if you're not Gen Z, you're not Gen Z. That's fine. The hope is that spaces are created where Gen Z has the opportunity to talk, and not just have that opportunity to talk so that you can say we gave them an opportunity to talk, but to involve in the decision-making process these youth. Yeah.
So I was just going to add, like, we're from Junior State of America, and it's, like, entirely student-run, where, like, we go to, like, for example, I had a convention in Austin just in the Omni Hotel where, like, I was the one making the agenda. I was the one, like, all the fundraising, everything is really student-run. So I think at its core, being able to, I think Gen Z is a generation that really wants to get their hands dirty, and if you really, like, put them in situations where they are doing things that maybe you feel like a kid shouldn't be responsible for doing, you're like, oh, might be too much. Maybe like give them the chance and they might prove you wrong. And also more lighthearted, I guess, is honestly just if you want to understand the weirdness and quirkiness of Gen Z, probably just go on TikTok and just like search. I don't know, just see like I don't know. We're just so.
That's more of a joke. But
yeah, that's more of a joke. Absolutely. But like, if that was the question, if that was like more, but anyways.
I do think that social media as a whole, I just like to conclude it with that. I do think that is very powerful, whether it be TikTok, Instagram, or paying attention to what students are reposting, because now that is our language.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess moving on to Ashna, she has a really interesting perspective, so take it away.
All right, yeah, so I will now be sharing a story about Nirav Tolia, who's the CEO and founder of Nextdoor, which is a social network that allows people to connect with their local communities. So Tolia grew up as a son of immigrant physicians from India, and he grew up in a small rural town in Texas. And his upbringing eventually laid the groundwork for the startups that he would be attracted to getting involved in and starting his own in the future. So his community, being very tightly knit and supportive, all cared for each other and supported each other. And from a cultural and moral perspective from his parents, they instilled the value of fearless ambition in him. As if any of you are children of immigrants, you might be able to relate to this. But he grew up with the question in mind, if Tolia's parents could uproot their lives and move across oceans in pursuit of a better life, what couldn't he do? And this question eventually led him to fulfill his version of the American dream. So he applied to Stanford and he got in, and he had a very strong interests on a pre-medical track in the STEM field. And however, upon being at Stanford, he realized his perception of the medical field and his STEM interests deviated from what he really saw. And following his heart, he eventually decided to pursue a major in English literature instead. However, these diverse experiences of his in college eventually rounded out his skill set, which would later lead to his entrepreneurial interests. He believes his STEM classes, he credits them towards helping him think critically, and his English literature classes for helping him communicate effectively, while his other extracurricular opportunities that he did at Stanford rounding things out. So I wanted to bring up his perspective because he had no business experience, but his vision is what led him. And using his skill set, he started a project in order to combat an issue he cared about, which is bringing communities closer together. So I wanted to use his story to bring up a business perspective on activism. That's a project-based perspective. So I feel that the world is becoming increasingly interdisciplinary. And using interdisciplinary knowledge, I feel that our generation has a tendency to lead project-based activism, as we are seeing more nonprofits, more businesses dedicated towards causes. Just like Caitlin was talking about, her interests in STEM and technology, in addition to policy. That is two different disciplines right there. And we are seeing many people in technology and even beyond technology intersecting a variety of their interests for one particular vision that they care to resolve or a particular issue that they care to combat. So I kind of just wanted to bring up that perspective on activism, which I feel Gen Z is definitely taking the lead in.
So you mentioned like how Gen Z is becoming more interdisciplinary, and I feel like Gen Z carries a strong curiosity for. I feel. Okay, so like when we were small and they'd ask us what career you want to do, I feel like in elementary school it would be very clear cut, like, oh, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be a teacher. But now I feel like a lot of my friends, they feel very unsure because they're so interested in so many different things. And that's like bringing this up, how has, like Ashna kind of alluded to it, but how has this sort of interdisciplinary, like multi-world mindset contributed to a change in activism?
I mean, I think that when people are exposed to a variety of disciplines, they understand an issue from a variety of standpoints. Like, I think technology, of course, is a very growing industry. And take a look at cryptocurrencies, for example, or any technological startup. I feel a lot of times when you see them or hear about them, they're addressing a greater world issue beyond just technology. When people are interested in technology and they're also interested in government and political science, they find a way to connect those two things. Oh, I have an idea for creating this new technology that is addressing social inequities or racial inequities that they might not be able to resolve just from a legislative standpoint or just from a policy standpoint. And I think that's really important because a lot of greater world issues and activist issues are like multifaceted and you can't just look at it from one perspective.
Adding to that, activism, when you think of it, you see in your head protests, you see people sending letters in to their elected officials, you see mobilization of people in communities. But just yesterday, I was at the science fair and I flew in just for this, just after my science fair, still in my blazer, just running around Denver airport. But my project was an environmental chemistry project, and I was trying to solve textile waste pollution using fresh cactus. And when I was going about this project, to me, this was environmental activism. The entire time when I was coming up with my methodology, when I was doing literature, when I was doing my conclusions and my economic analysis, doing a circular approach of this scientific project, I had to understand the social implications and the economic implications of this project. And it added to the feasibility of this project. And it tied all of my interests together. And I was just making a research paper and conducting a research project. But to me, that was still activism. And to the people around me and to the judges who were listening to my conversations about this experience that I had, they all saw in me that I had that spark and that interest in trying to help our planet, whether it's not specifically related to climate change, but it has to do with solving the consequences of weak environmental policy. And that's where these things tie in together. It's not just being vocal in our generation, it's about having action, whether that's through social media or through a science project.
Absolutely. I want to add on to that. So last year, I did a year-long research project on decentralized finance and cryptocurrencies, and it was directly related to how can unbanked populations or populations who don't have access to financial institutions gain the ability to socially mobilize using emerging technologies like these. And so I think when you look at it from a standpoint of like, look at these emerging innovations and look at all of these new ideas that we are coming up with and look at their various implications, take like research or any sort of investigation that way, you're addressing a greater problem and a greater implication that is just beyond the technology itself.
Yeah, and like I think it's really interesting that like Maritza mentions that like what we traditionally think about as activism, because I think one of the main messages from like hopefully from this panel is that activism isn't just like what we envision like initially, like the stereotypes of activism, I guess. It's like much more multifaceted and nuanced to that. And I think tying it back, I guess like since most of you guys are all educators or work a lot with students, all of this, though, comes from the classroom. Like, our interests, like, for me personally, I was really influenced by a computer science teacher who kind of showed me, like, very basic Hello World printing stuff that I just thought was fun and cool. And then that kind of translated into me later joining, like clubs that she, like, was pushing me to join, like, and do, like, coding competitions and whatever. But, like, this, I think it's a very, like, important question to ask you guys is, like, well, from an educator's perspective or as students, what do you think is the most impactful thing a teacher can do to foster like the curiosity early on?
Push us out of our comfort zone, whether it's through an assignment or a reading or just speaking to us. I would have been much more involved in the project side of activism if I had taken my physics class in 9th grade. Give us essays, make us do research, make us learn, and we'll discover the topics that we're most interested in, or we'll discover that, you know, maybe we just never want to go into physics and we still learn from that. There's no right or wrong way to figure out what you want to do. And having an encouraging teacher and an encouraging administration that's not telling us, oh, go do a science project, but is telling us, why do you care about this issue, and what components of this issue do you think you can solve on a community-based level? Don't think instant global movement. Think, what can I do in my own community to alter the route that things are going? And you can do that. And all of us have done that in our high schools.
Yeah, and I think, oh wait, Ariel, were you
Oh,
going
no,
to
you
say?
can go ahead.
Oh, no.
Okay, well, we see a push among district administrators for differentiated learning. So obviously, we can see that there is a general movement towards creating multiple opportunities for students to learn at different paces, to learn in different ways. And I think that is something that is important to Gen Z. As someone who's interested in filmmaking, for example, being able to use film for topics that are related to history or social sciences. I could self-produce a documentary, for example, and then that extended beyond my curricular learning and went into my ability to engage with a hobby and engage with a passion of mine. So allowing people to find their areas of specialty while also pushing their comfort zone, as Maritza said, is definitely something that can help people engage with the learning.
Yeah, and like following up on that, I think this is like a great question that comes to you guys is, what do you think is the best way to empower students to use class curriculum for real-world applications? Like, how can we turn classroom into community impact? Like, any thoughts from y'all?
First of all, y'all are amazing. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Try
we can
and
hear
tilt
it.
the mic like this.
Well, I'm too short for that.
Or you can
But-
have it like
Okay,
this and then
okay.
put it like
winning.
that.
Okay. First of all, y'all are amazing. I am so impressed with y'all. Second of all, the best way to empower students to use class curriculum for real-world applications is just like you said, really getting their buy-in and tapping into their interests and really tapping into their community. I am fresh out of the classroom in my new role. But when I was in the classroom, I was an intervention teacher with students who had never passed a single math test in their life. And when I started teaching, they're like, oh, you're going to have this class. And I was like, what is this class? What are we doing? And they're like, yeah, you're just going to basically teach them what you're already teaching your other kids. And they really taught me how to differentiate my students, because I had to find a way to engage every single one of them who had already been turned off to math. Like, I've already not passed this, I don't care about your class. And so I really had to build the community with them and figure out, like, what do you like to do? Oh, you like to make posters all day. Cool. What do you like to do? Oh, you like to build things. Okay. What do you like to do? Oh, you like to play games. Okay. And it had to really foster an environment that brought out all of those things, to empower them to learn, but then applying it to the real world. So we would build things, or we would talk about things that were applicable to them and to our community, so that they would actually learn math. But I mostly came up here because y'all are amazing, and I'm like, I have a question for y'all. Can I ask one?
Yes.
I'm in a new role, and we are constantly trying to figure out how to appeal to Gen Z as far as like hiring and how can we get y'all involved. And I hear y'all talking about like, well, it's hard for us to say, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer. We have all these interdisciplinary interests and multifaceted. So like, what do you want to see in your future workplace? Like, what are you, if I wanted you to come be a teacher for me, what do you want to see?
Support from peers. Again, at a predominantly white school, I have teachers who are black and feel othered by their peers through microaggressions and through generally not being welcomed by every single one of their peers. And that's a problem, just point blank, that can't really be allowed to continue. So I think we see a rise in shit, like Gen Z is not gonna sit in one career, like one job, and hold it down for the remainder of their career. They will move around if they're unsatisfied. So creating not just a workplace, but allowing for communities that are, again, as you mentioned, buy-in. There needs to be buy-in among all members of staff communities. And we can see that through staff lunch and learns, staff book clubs, affinity groups among staff, because creating that community, not just for students, but for staff, does reflect onto students. I, as a student, do feel the community that my teachers feel, or the lack thereof.
Also, giving us the opportunity, like if I were a teacher, I would love the opportunity to make alterations to the curriculum. And that's something that's done at my charter school, and it's something that's been very effective.
Yeah, I would say I think feedback is a really key component that I feel like a lot of schools tend to miss, or there's not accessibility to that feedback. Yes, you can go talk to your principal, but is it guaranteed that they will listen? Is it guaranteed that they actually take in student feedback? Like Ariel was mentioning earlier, do we have students participating in decision making? Do we have a student representative on the board, or things like that? And I think that that's really interesting, but I wanted to, and like important, but I wanted to bring up a point of, I think, with like how individualized student interests are and how individualized like our career paths are in the future, like what we strive to do. I feel like one thing I want to bring up is the creativity of that all, and like the ability to perform a job with how we wish to do so. Like Ariel was saying, even from a student standpoint, I mean, I sing, and if I could do that for a lot of my assignments, or understand the significance of math or science with voice or with music that I'm really interested in, I think that that's also a really key component in making students really intellectually curious. And for example, like how Ariel was saying, similar to how a student might want to participate in a documentary creating for a project, I think even in workplaces, that can go beyond just students. In workplaces, if people could do that to express how they would like to convey their job, I think that that's a really key component.
I want to add one final point really quickly. Samuel Kostman, the principal I mentioned at George Washington High School, when he came in and he noticed that there was a lot of scattering among teachers and students, what he did was he provided, he told people, you can come to my office anytime between these hours. But he recognized that that doesn't work for everyone. Some people want more structure. So he additionally offered meet the principal sessions that were in the auditorium. And he offered parental meeting sessions in the auditorium. So as much as we differentiate learning, you also have to differentiate the way that administration approaches communication, because it won't work for everyone. And as Samuel Kostman he wrote an article, a research paper after his experience at George Washington that I highly recommend. So differentiating learning as well as differentiating administration.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is really, thank you so much for all this feedback, because it's like analyzing my own generation on the spot too. So I guess lastly, I'm here for a question and answer. We have around like 3 minutes left. So if anyone else has any other questions, I'd love for you guys to stop.
Add your questions,
to give
please.
questions.
Okay, I love the wording of this question. So incomprehensible Luddites exacerbate the intersectional complexities of the anthropocentric view of modernity. How can GSAs forge new ground in this space? So GSAs can overcome the incomprehensible Luddites by, strong stances. We see the three-pronged approach that was taken by the students at George Washington in making their essentially a manifesto. So making those strong stances and refusing to concede, they said very clearly, we will not stand for textbooks in the school that do not support us. So that is one way to overcome it. Thank you so much for the comment.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Thank you
So
so much.
anthropocentric view of modernity. I think if you have any sort of reactionary politics, that's just something that can be combated with education. So just providing in classes, if you're teaching history, teach the queer history too, because there's lots of it.
Learn from polarization. Don't push against it.
I think even just talking about like various spaces and various identities within a school, I think one really important thing that teachers can do is make themselves available to talk, make yourselves available to like support students. If they are trying to make a greater impact on administration or the school board, make yourself say, hey, or like you can talk to me about any more, or even teaching about LGBTQ history. That communicates to the students that I'm a safe person to talk to if you would like to talk about these things. And so when a student is maybe trying to make greater impact on like the administration level, that way they know that I have a teacher who can advocate for me, so my voice is not marginalized.
I think I'm confident when saying that Gen Z is a generation of not tolerating aggression and not tolerating people who are not empathetic. My school, there's around 40 of us in my grade. In 8th grade, we felt that the 8th grade teacher who was teaching us English was taking advantage of the administration, was not teaching us what we needed to learn to be able to pass our tests, because we have these huge tests at the end of the year worth 50% of our total grade. And if we can't pass that, we can't continue on to high school. And I'm just letting you know, we were a little fierce. We wrote a 20-page manifesto. We were 14, 15. And so that keeps translating into activism and into the power that we see these youth show when we can find common ground. We find issues that we all mutually care about. Even if we have different perspectives on it, we can mobilize and make change.
Teach students how to engage. They have school boards. They have local boards. So please teach people how to engage with their boards, whether it's public comment or sending letters.
So the question, how can we help fight? Sorry, we're almost out of time. And we're going to be here a little bit after if you guys want to talk
I can read this last question if you want.
You can also text us on LinkedIn, which we'll put up here.
So the question is, Gen Z seems to be particularly misunderstood by older generations. How can we help fight stereotypes so that current leaders take Gen Z advocacy more seriously?
Spotlight Gen Z leaders that are current leaders in government. That's a good way of going about it. there's a lot of emerging youth leaders that we're seeing in government. That's a great way to start. And looking at academics, which are in our generation, that's a good way to start. Yeah,
We just elected our very first Gen Z congressperson.
exactly.
I also think that a lot of these stereotypes are also like advantages, like it's a double-edged sword. Yes, we're very informed, but also I do see like the flaw. We do have flaws to our generation, and those flaws are just easily broadcast because social media. All your mistakes are like online, and you have a very strong digital footprint. So I guess really giving the opportunity for Gen Z to take action and like really plan things themselves, I think is just one thing that, because they're incredibly capable. But with that, I guess like we included a QR code about Junior State of America. If you guys want
Check us out.
if you want to check out, we start at the chapter level, so just a little self plug for JSA, and also we've
Encourage your students to start chapters.
Yes,
Yeah.
join JSA.
If your school does not have JSA, you want your students to have a JSA.
Yeah.
I guarantee.
Connect
just a
with
little
us.
bit of promotion. But also we have our LinkedIn's posted here, and thank you so much everyone for
Thank
this.
you all for
and
coming.
It's been a
Thank
pleasure
you.
being able to talk
Thank
to
you.
y'all.
Thank you all so much.